I'm going to hand it over to Michael Hilliard, who is the Director of Defense Security Analysis at the Oxa Center, and he's gonna lead the presentation. Andrew Gundall is also gonna be involved in the presentation. So, Michael, take it away.
Look, it wouldn't be a military presentation if everything ran smoothly at the start. So so we'll make it work. So it's absolutely great to be here. I'll throw to my slides because they're far more interesting than my face. Give me a second. And there we go. So the presentation we're talking about here, myself and my colleague Andrew, is going to be about the armed forces of Central Asia, which is a fascinating subject that has been pretty under-researched in my personal opinion. Obviously, this has been part of a massive report that Oxford Society has been putting together. Effectively, there's been two public chapters released, those on Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, and all the public versions of those chapters with Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and all the charts coming out in due course as well. So as part of this project, we not only compended this sort of 1,200-page analysis on what these militaries are doing, what they're capable of, how they're going, but we've also mapped out about 5,800 locations or military and security locations across the region. So I'm at the point where I've seen so much Central Asian dirt, but it's fascinating to look into these militaries, and it's a study that has been amazing to be sort of put together over the time. And I guess one of the reasons I always get asked, why study these militaries? Why study militaries at all in this manner? And it's one of the reasons I really enjoy or really think it's interesting is that militaries are really long-term planning in most cases. They tell you a huge amount of what the government thinks are going through the issues in 10, 15, 20 years, because it doesn't matter who's in power in the capital. You still have a border with Afghanistan. You still have that region that is has a difference in culture or have separatist opinions. So studying how a military is built, where it's deployed, where they choose to put the resources, will tell you a huge amount about what that government is thinking in the long term. And hopefully today we'll be having a look at all five militaries and effectively giving everyone an idea on our analysis on that one. If you have questions in the chat, you can also put those in there. I'm happy to answer those as we go. But I guess a good place to start is what really drives defense policy here in Central Asia. We're going to focus on just these five, even though, that might upset the Azeris and the Afghans, but we're going to just keep it to the five for today. But generally, I think the best place to start, if you've never thought about the Central Asian militaries, is the fact that almost every graph is going to look somewhat similar to this. This being a graph of effectively military spending in 2024. You can see here effectively Kazakhstan spends the most, but not by too much. Uzbekistan not far behind. Turkmenistan kind of in that middle of the pack, and then Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan coming up the rear. This is a pretty normal, and a lot of your graphs are going to look like this. Force totals, it does get slightly different. And again, I'm going to say why I have this slide here is to show that we're trying to keep it as consistent. As an example, some militaries will keep the Ministry of Emergency Situations in the military, some won't, but we'll keep it as consistent as we can to make it easy. Now, obviously, we don't have all the time in the world, so we're going to go straight to effectively looking at these five militaries. And I guess the best place to start with would be Tajikistan, which, as we went through, is going to be the smallest of the five budgets. Now, Tajikistan is one of the really interesting ones to look at because a lot of the drivers in the country, obviously, it's low budget, but part of it is also political. And again, this is that long-term thinking I was talking about at the start of the presentation, where if you look at, let's say, our top left map here, the one here, I'll actually put my blue, the red here is effectively the furthest extent the opposition forces got during the civil war. The green being the areas that remained loyal to Rahman, who is effectively in power today. And today, if you look at the post-war deployments map, you can see that most of the military, the armor, the heavier firepower is based in areas that remained loyal to the government during that period. That is a political decision to make sure that those areas are always better armed than anywhere else. It also tells you on what kind of fighting they're anticipating as well. And this is what I mean by long-term planning, that, the guys that are based here in the south are heavier, more conventional forces, but the guys that are in Gorno-Badakhshan or in the sort of Gam Valley are the faster, lighter mountain warfare guys that are usually designed to go counter, insurgents or mountain fighters. And that, again, it's that you look at that and you can tell what their priorities are going to be in time. Part of it is also in a lot of drivers in these countries is old Soviet infrastructure as well. As an example here, this map here is Tajikistan's rail network. And the first thing you can notice if you're a defense planner is the fact that you can't actually move lots of equipment from your southern areas to the north without the permission of Uzbekistan, which that's going to have massive sort of implications for how you defend, what decisions you can make, how quickly you can move things. And a lot of the time, it's Soviet infrastructure and pre-existing decisions that are going to force future decisions as well, which is why I think it's interesting to look at. Then there's obviously foreign bases. For Tajikistan in particular, it's got quite a lot of Russian assets in the area. In fact, the largest Russian base outside of Russia or Ukraine. And obviously, you've got the Chinese PAP facility, and that will tell you a huge amount about how all those countries see themselves in the operating the country and what they are looking to do going forward. The Russians, for instance, take a much more conventional approach in Tajikistan, being tanks, boots on the ground, and having a pretty significant tank force. About a 20-minute drive from the palace or the national palace. Whereas the Chinese are much lighter. It's a people's armed police base with very little. It's only about 600 personnel. It's in the absolute middle of nowhere, and their role has been mostly to sort of, rather than putting their own boots on the ground, pay the Tajik border services to effectively put on lots and lots of their own brigades to protect the border on behalf of China. Again, it's just an interesting way of how these two states differ in their approach here. Part of it is also, economics is going to be a massive driver. And I'm not just saying that because, if you can't tell by the sadness in my voice, I'm an economics major. But if you'll, let's say, look at Tajikistan here, it's 48% of their entire GDP comes from remittances at the moment, which means that if you're Russia, you can effectively cut off, you can just say, I'm changing the visa rules tomorrow or cutting off banking, and 48% of the GDP disappears tomorrow. And that, even just that one fact, gives Russia massive leverage over the decision-making within Tajikistan. If you're sitting in Dushanbe, that will be kind of driving a lot of decisions, regardless of what you want to do. Kyrgyzstan is down here. Uzbekistan's got a little bit, and obviously Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan have less than 1%. It's quite a small amount of remittances in those economies. Other factors are, as we talked about, borders make a massive decision on where you start putting your resources and troops. For every dollar you spend on placing a troop into GAM is a dollar you don't spend defending, let's say, the Afghan border. And part of this mapping project, this is a map of southern Tajikistan, the green being Tajikistan, the brown being Afghanistan, this is Uzbekistan. And tell me if you can find where the Afghan border is. The Tajiks have spent a huge amount of resources and attention, some of it pre-existing from the Soviet era, and part of it has been massively built up either by the Tajiks, the Russians, or the Chinese to really protect the border with Tajikistan, or with Afghanistan, sorry. And as we saw just a couple of days ago, where drones are flying across, which ended up taking the lives of Chinese mining workers, this is one of the most contested borders in Central Asia. If you are, let's say, a smuggler looking to get stuff out of Afghanistan, Turkmenistan is probably a little bit difficult. It's a little bit remote. And once you get across the border, it's a lot of desert highway. Uzbekistan is mostly sort of guarded by a single river, a single bridge crossing, and much better defended. So Tajikistan tends to be where the smuggling routes are, which is why you tend to see this massive militarization toward the border. But at the same time, if we look at the north of the country, they also have a lot of military assets up here as well, because of the fact that, particularly recently, when there was a fight in this area around Batkum between Kyrgyz forces and Tajik forces, that these guys are, concerned that there may be another engagement up here. And we'll talk. If you're Tajikistan, you now have to kind of contend with the fact that you have to put resources in the south, Afghanistan, whilst also keeping enough assets in the north that you deter any aggression from the Kyrgyz, whilst also not putting too much assets in the north that maybe maybe if there's a separatist movement out there, they could pull away, because it's going to be very difficult to resupply or take those areas back if there was, let's say, a pull away in the north. I don't think there will be, but those are decisions that if you're a long-term commander, you're probably going to have in the back of your head the whole time for Tajikistan. Now, if we look at, let's say, Tajikistan's annual defense budget, before we move on to other countries, you can see here that prior to sort of 2021, defense spending is fairly flat. And this is actually quite common across a few of these regions. Particularly Kyrgyzstan, as we'll go through, is almost identical, pattern to what Tajikistan has here. And then after 2021 and some of the first clashes between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, spending really jumped up. And then after the 2022 clashes, spending hits an all-time high. And then effectively now it's starting to turn back down, because the temperature is starting to cool down between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. They're starting to sort their border issues. They're at least finding a way that it's less likely that they accidentally fall into border conflict. But you can just see here that the decisions being made are, direct calculations based on what's happening on the ground here. Um, it'll probably, my guess is settle somewhere around here, but that's still a bit higher than what the average has been, which is kind of around the, let's call it 0.08, 0.9% mark of GDP. Again, I'm going to kind of lay out when looking at all five of these militaries, sorry, is, all of them have very similar command structures, very Soviet in their nature, but it's where the differences are that I think tells you a huge amount of, what's going on within the government and what their priorities and planning are. So as you see, this is a really kind of conventional way of doing things. The president's at the top, he sits atop the Security Council, and you've got the various ministries, so defense, internal affairs. You've got your ground forces, what for the US audience would you call the army, the Tajik Air and Air Defense Forces, what you guys would call the Air Force. They've got mobile forces. That's a bit different. Sometimes most countries just put those in the ground forces, but a separate branch inside Tajikistan. You got internal troops, which are, they don't have the heavy artillery or the tanks, but they have effectively good riot, armored vehicles, truncheons, tear gas. These guys are who you would deploy when the police really can't handle what's going on. And then you've got guys like the border service. And this is where I think it's really interesting to understand when you're looking at these militaries is the fact that, a border service personnel not only has no, command chain that connects with the ground forces, to the point where when the fighting kicked off in 2022 between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, that the ground forces learned about it from Twitter because there's no connection there between the two. But the border services only answer effectively to the State Committee for National Security, what used to be the KGB, and now the president. So it means that there's a really distinct chain of command and very different rules of engagement. If you are a ground forces personnel and you want to see an enemy troop, you have to call your commander who calls their commander who calls their commander. If you're a border service personnel, you get to fire at anything that moves. Rules of engagement are very different. And then obviously you've got the Committee for Emergency Situations and Civil Defense, which is, it's hard to find a kind of exact American equivalent, but they're mostly mountain search and rescue, mine collapsing, the guys you call an emergency to come save people, but they are technically part of the military. And then obviously the National Guard is the last one. Now the National Guard is effectively a strike force you can call in when you need to. It's usually fairly small, but usually better trained and answers directly to the president. So let's say there was an attack on a facility somewhere, the president, rather than having to call the general who calls the da-da-da, he could call the National Guard, and the National Guard goes and does that and quickly moves out there. There is a National Guard in most of these countries, but where it sits is, completely different. As an example, National Guard here in Tajikistan answers directly to the president. In Kyrgyzstan, it's part of the Ministry of Defense. In Uzbekistan, it answers directly to the president. In Turkmenistan, it's part of the ground forces. And I'm missing one. And in Kazakhstan, it's part of the internal forces. So again, it's these slight oddities that'll tell you a huge amount where the country's going. So let's move to Kyrgyzstan for a bit. That was Tajikistan's command chain. Kyrgyzstan's is even more simplified. As we can see here, the National Guard has been shifted under the command of the Ministry of Defense. And I think when people ask me what, am I looking for in Kyrgyzstan, and I found it really interesting talking with locals. I just got back from there about a week ago. So you can look here that effectively, yes, they have the same problem with the State Guard border service, answering straight to the president. But this has become massively powerful in recent years. They got the majority of the drones. They got the majority of the airstrike materials. In fact, the Kyrgyz Air Force is now the third best air force in Kyrgyzstan because they sit behind the SBGS and also the Russian Air Force as well. So, but you think literally other tidbits are things like the Presidential Security Service. The guys, what the US would, I guess, call the Secret Service. Sorry about that. Sits underneath the intelligence agencies. The president doesn't control his own security service, which again is quite a unique thing for the region. It shows you that there's a huge amount of trust between the president and his chief of security, who's Tashev, as compared to, let's say, Uzbekistan, where there's very little trust between the president and his head of the security services. But again, there are some things that are almost exactly the same. The example here is the rail network, effectively looking at, the same exact problems that Tajikistan has, where if you, let's say, deployed in the north or defending the north, well, you can't really supply the south very easily. The roads are not built for that. It's very difficult to resupply along this area. So you end up having effectively two distinct commands, having one in the north and one in the south. And guys in the south kind of have to operate understanding that they will not be reinforced from the north, and the guys in the north have to understand they won't be reinforced from the south. Yeah, and then you have problems like this. This is the sort of a highway that connects Razakov to Butkin to Osh. This is running right along the border at occasions, and even sort of right through some of the areas where the fighting was at heaviest in the last conflict. Now, if you're, let's say, putting your troops out in Razakov or out here, that's pretty nerve-wracking if you're a commander and you know that all your supplies have to come down those roads because at any point that could be cut off by an enemy. They don't have to advance a K or two to make that happen. And again, these are decisions that are, doesn't matter who's in power in Bishkek, these are constant problems that will need to be solved. You know, as well as the fact that ammunition quite often goes from areas right on the other side of the country as well. If you're fighting in Batkin, most of your ammunition is going to come all the way down from Osh, which adds a whole other level of problems as well. As you can see here, we've got Northern Command, which has to, effectively a lot of this area is quite remote as well, though. But Southern Command, who's becoming increasingly important within the Kyrgyz military and armed services at the moment, is have to deal with the entire Fergana Valley, which is a pretty tall task, considering that's where you have Uzbekistan owning this, you have Tajikistan here, and also China over here as well. If we look at, here's part of our mapping project, but here is the major bases in the country, and you can just see that there's this kind of almost bifurcation, which again was not really driven by, I'd say, a direct thought or committee in Kyrgyzstan that made that. It's by natural geography, by population centers, and by long-term planning of, okay, well, we don't know if we can resupply from one side to the other. We probably need to build up enough capabilities in the south to be able to defend ourselves. And if you go with sort of looking at more bases, you can see that whilst some of these small border outposts, along the Chinese border are kind of few and far between, there's a massive amount in the Fergana Valley, because that's where they think, again, the dollars have to go where they're most needed. And for the Kyrgyz, they've mostly decided that the dollars are best needed right here along the Fergana Valley. And that, again, would ring true, particularly after the Osh riots of 2010 and recent events with Tajikistan. With a bit of a closer map, you can just see that putting all these outposts this close to the border, because that's where they think the most instability will come from. Whereas if you look at the north, whilst, yes, there's a lot of tanks up there, I don't think they're worried about Kazakhstan or China coming in from that angle. And you can see here that when you compare border services, a lot of these long-term decisions just immediately rock up as well. That you have Kyrgyzstan, who knows that, because of the way the Fergana Valley is, and a lot of their major cities that are, let's say, vulnerable are right there on the border. They put lots of extra material and men and a disproportionate amount of resources into their border, sort of personnel into their border service, knowing that any engagement is likely going to be directly impacted. If you're Uzbekistan, you can afford to put a brigade, 30, 40 Ks behind the border and eventually have to deal with it once the enemy comes in. With Kyrgyzstan, the moment your enemy crosses the border, they're going to be cutting major roads, they're going to be cutting major infrastructure. And again, that's why the border services, as well as Tashiyev's political connections, are becoming increasingly powerful. One of the reasons they're becoming increasingly powerful in the state. And as I said, Tajikistan's annual defense spending, Kyrgyzstan's is really similar. That same pretty flat, everyone's pretty happy. No one can attack, no one poses a direct threat to the other. But then obviously the issue started up in 2021. 2022 is when the major engagement happens. Record spending in 2023, although I will kind of put an asterisk on that and say there is allegations that part of that was also sort of sending additional materials off to Russia that were purchased by Kyrgyzstan. Even if we put it where we think it would be, which is about here, it still shows that this is, again, a mirror to make sure they sort of matching what Tajikistan does. And now that Tajikistan started to step down, Kyrgyzstan starting to step down their spending as well. Uzbekistan, I'm going to throw next to Andrew after that, Turkmenistan. But yes, Uzbekistan has the largest population, so it kind of makes sense that they would have the largest army of the five. And rather than having a kind of, this is a quite conventional order of battle, Uzbekistan has a much larger, much more complex, and frankly, weird command structure compared to the five. But I probably don't have time to get into all that today. And unlike, let's say, a Kyrgyzstan, where there's this, pretty, let's say, lacking infrastructure, Uzbekistan doesn't have that issue. Uzbekistan has these rail networks that are pre-built. It's designed to move stuff around the country. So they can afford to, let's say, and it's what they do, they tend to have, artillery guys here. And then if there's a war in the south, well, we can move them down the road. If there's a war in the north, well, we can move them up the road. What I do find interesting is why you have this kind of five commands and some operational commands as well. And you can see here that most of your troops and materials are not only concentrated around Tashkent and the valley, but when you look at the major brigade level deployments, which I can pull up a map afterwards in VB, you can see here there's what they've decided to put where is really telling of what their priorities are going to be. So for down here in the south, these are mostly kind of really heavier tank units. A lot of these guys are kind of leftovers from the Soviet-Afghan war, but a lot of it is that if Uzbekistan feels it's going to have a conventional threat, it's probably going to come from Afghanistan or from the southern approaches out of kind of Dushanbe here. That's why there's a lot of tanks down there. In the center of the artillery areas, because again, they're mostly going to be training in very remote, barren areas, and artillery usually acts as support units. So you put them in the center so you can move into whatever front you need. In the center, in sort of the, around Tashkent, again, a lot of fast moving, a lot of better operators, good tank units to guard the Kamchik tunnel, that one tunnel that connects effectively Tashkent and the valley, and all your fast movers mostly are in the valley. And I think one of the major things we kept coming across, and it doesn't matter whether it was a low kind of a private or whether it was a very high up officer we interviewed for the project, is that Andijan continued to come up. And they kept talking about, if anyone's not aware, Andijan was an incident in 2005 where effectively a number of dissidents, about 80 of them, managed to, they started an uprising, they managed to take a motor rifle base, then they successfully took an MIA base, took the town administration center, and then managed to take more and more of the town until, nearly a day and a bit later, the Uzbeks came back and it ended up with many Uzbeks losing their lives due to the government response. And it's why the government has, since 2005, put this massive emphasis in, rather than having this big, bulky, artillery-heavy kind of Soviet military, having a military that can move really quickly anywhere. That, if there is that we could quickly go and deal with that. And that's, no matter what the rank is, officers kept kind of bringing it up to us saying, had we, crushed that riot by day, within 6 hours, none of this would be a big story. It would have been something that got out of the press in a week. And I think that's quite telling for how they've deployed their military. Again, this is something we probably have, we're cutting a little bit short on time, so I'll kind of probably answer that in Q&A. But I'm going to throw to my Turkmenistan and just tell me when you need me to skip slides, Andrew, because Andrew did more of the research on the Turkmen chapter. So I'm very keen to hear his thoughts on what is probably the strangest of the 5 militaries.
Alrighty. Thank you, Michael. Really appreciate it. Yep. So as Michael said, right, Turkmenistan is probably the oddest of the 5, right? It's a country that operates quite contrary to any normal expectations, right? Despite its natural gas wealth, vast natural gas wealth, boasting similar quantities to reserves to that of Qatar, it maintains strict isolationism. It has heavy state control and opaque institutions that limit both foreign engagement and internal transparency. So quite unlike the level of cooperation that exists among the other 4 Central Asian states, Turkmenistan's strict isolation has been rooted in its doctrine of neutrality, which was adopted into its constitution in 1995. Now, guided by the idea of neutrality, the country has consistently avoided joining major multilateral political and security organizations, setting it apart from its Central Asian neighbors. Now, resultantly, Turkmenistan has ended up as one of the most isolationist countries in the world, seeing its seclusion matched with extreme repression and state control. Now, to put this in perspective, in Freedom House's latest Freedom Scale rankings, Turkmenistan placed only just 2 points below North Korea. Now, this approach began under President Niyazov, who imagined Turkmenistan as a neutral venue for regional conflict resolution. In the 1990s, it briefly played that role, hosting negotiating parties from the Tajik and Afghan civil wars. But beyond these early moments, neutrality has not translated into meaningful mediation efforts. Instead, neutrality evolved into a broader strategy of isolationism. Successive governments, first under Niyazov and then under Berdimuhamedov, used neutrality to justify limiting international contact, avoiding regional organizations, and restricting foreign political or security engagement. This has, for the most part, kept the country economically and diplomatically cut off from the outside world. Now, critics argue that this self-imposed isolation has hampered Turkmenistan's economic development and reduced its ability to participate in regional security structures. But officials in Ashgabat would claim the opposite, that neutrality has in fact protected the country from regional conflicts and instability and preserved its political independence. So from a military perspective, Turkmenistan's policy of neutrality has translated into banning all foreign military bases and personnel from officially operating on its soil as well as not providing any commitments on multilateral military cooperations or agreements, particularly since 1999, when the Russian Turkmen Troop Corporation was discontinued. So when we look at the rail system in Turkmenistan, it reflects the country's broader pattern of doing things in ways that differ from international expectations. Despite presenting itself as a state focused on modernization and independence, its railway network still relies heavily on old Soviet infrastructure, materials, and design standards. Much of the track, rolling stock, and signaling technology date back to the Soviet period, despite modernized procurement efforts from Russia and China, meaning that trains run on an aging equipment that is often slower and less efficient than modern systems elsewhere in the region. Railway connections do exist between Turkmenistan and its neighbors, but only a quarter of that freight volume crosses these borders. The vast majority of Turkmen trade still happens by road, despite all the rail networks and planning. However, the important point is these Soviet built rail and pipelines are meant to filter straight into Russia, meaning that its outdated structure limits the country's ability to effectively diversify. Now, when we look at the highway that crosses the entire country, the M37 highway, the majority of the country operates on this highway, connecting Ashgabat to its other major cities. But the infrastructure planning remains significantly outdated. Under the Soviet Union, the structure of the M37 indicated a military focus towards defending the country from Iran. However, with Ashgabat having prioritized the securitization of its border with Afghanistan since independence, a lack of both road and rail infrastructure similar to what exists near the Iranian border remains contradictory, given that most of Turkmenistan's military bases are located near the M37. Now, despite a lack of proper roads and railways near the Afghan border, Turkmenistan still hasn't committed investments, leaving security risks and significant vulnerabilities in the eastern part of the country. All of the infrastructure in the country is linearly connected, meaning that if any city in the country is taken over, then the country is effectively cut off through its infrastructure from that point. Most countries would normally prioritize an issue to this magnitude, but Turkmenistan instead opts to refrain from taking proper action to address what many analysts would identify as a significant security risk. Now, when we look at the trade and exports that are exhibited, right, this pattern continues. Realistically, seeing the level of isolationism that Turkmenistan has thrown itself into, it would aim to facilitate trade through a set of diversified partners and expand its export portfolio. Given what we can see with Uzbekistan's exports, it has targeted a relatively healthy range of exports, lowering its risks to external shocks that could impact its export revenue. However, when looking at Turkmenistan's exports, it has essentially thrown all its eggs into one basket, bringing over 90% of its trade revenue purely through gas exports, sending a significant majority of that to China. Now, all of this gas flows through three parallel pipelines, right? Without any progress being made to diversify and construct a planned fourth pipeline headed for China as well. Now, this trade practice remains incredibly risky, as one disruption in pipeline damage, deteriorated trade or political relations with China, or market changes could severely damage the Turkmen state revenue at an alarming rate. Now, whilst Turkmenistan, unlike Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, has minimal to no remittances entering the economy, minimizing its reliance on foreign economies, its export policies to China remain contradictory, allowing China to almost individually manage and leverage the price of Turkmen gas exports. So, when looking at the command structures, Michael, do you want to add some of your thoughts, given that you've previously covered this quite recently?
We are sort of running the Turkmenistan. Again, it just adds to what Andrew was saying about it's such a contradictory kind of military. On one hand, you have absolute consolidation within the economy, that everything effectively gets exported to China, everything goes down single highways, everything is kind of really built in and just piggybacking off Soviet infrastructure. And at the same time, in its command structures, they've broken apart a whole bunch of departments to avoid having too much power or efficiency concentrated in any one unit. Partly because it's not, the administration feels it's good to have people compete amongst themselves, and partly because they don't want anyone strong enough to pose a threat to the administration. It really is a military more driven by kind of politics and parade readiness, and I guess paranoia is not the right word, but it's not the wrong one, than any of the other four. And I know, Andrew, you were looking at some of the border stuff on the border with Afghanistan, and you can just see here the massive concentration. But yeah, I'll let you take it from my take on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So yeah, when it comes to Turkmenistan's security and instability concerns, Turkmenistan's military positioning reflects three key areas, right? One being threats from Afghanistan, domestic insurrection, and disputes arising in the Caspian Sea. Now, as we can see here, Turkmenistan has built up the infrastructure and outposts to fill a large portion of the Afghan border, as relatively small concerns persist about any invasion from Afghanistan. But border skirmishes between Turkmen and Afghan forces and apprehensions over ISKP presence in northern Afghanistan do still persist. However, Turkmenistan has significantly failed with the upkeep of these border posts, with many outposts operating without quality internet, proper infrastructure, or even in some cases personnel. Despite Afghanistan continuing to be a highly prioritized issue, Turkmenistan still puts its funding towards military parades rather than focus on funding towards its militarily pertinent issues. So when we specifically
So,
look
so
at
just to add,
Ashgabat,
just add
please.
one thing in there. Some of these border posts we have photos of that are now manned by mannequins because they can't afford to put enough border personnel there. I just thought that was a weird tidbit to kind of stress that point. But yes, we'll go straight to Ashgabat.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Yeah, so Turkmenistan's military is also focused on right one of its other biggest concerns, right? Any form of domestic insurrection, right? Ashgabat has prioritized the protection of its capital, investing heavily into bases and forces stationed across the city, aiming to quash any resistance that could possibly materialize in the country. Whilst you have your border forces, you barely have enough stockpiles to make enough of a pushback on instability along the Afghan border, whereas internal forces are actually quite well armed and equipped to quickly take care of and manage any domestic issues that could arise. Now, when we look at the Caspian, while Turkmenistan is still building up its naval capabilities, having essentially built it up from scratch since 2010, it has modernized comparatively fast. Whilst other branches of the military still rely significantly on Soviet era equipment, the Turkmen Navy has a relatively modern maritime fleet, being supported by joint ventures with Turkish naval manufacturers. It is unclear why this branch of the military has so much funding, potentially because of Caspian trade routes, the protectionism of oil fields, or for just another pompous show to highlight the quality of its entire military. Now, when we look forward, whilst the Turkmen military has positioned itself in these areas, it still acts contradictory when looking at its future security. Water scarcity remains one of the most pressing issues that threatens the country's stability, with its entire riparian flow sourced from upstream Central Asian countries. Now, the worsening of climate change in the region and the further divergent plans through the Kosh-Tepe Canal continue to put the future of Turkmenistan's water supply in question. Now, despite this, Turkmenistan has failed to take any necessary action to mitigate the issue in the future, still filling the capital with fountains and golf courses, watching water evaporate away. Money is still desperately needed to fix the infrastructure to hold and sustain the water supply. But again, infrastructure remains an unattractive form of government spending for the Turkmens, and therefore it gets deprioritized, adding to the array of problems that the country still has and will face in the future. Thank you, Michael.
Perfect. So I'm going to race through Kazakhstan because we know we got the Q&A and questions coming in. But effectively, Kazakhstan, I guess, is obviously the biggest. It's the most rich of the five states. And when you look at GDP, it's really easy to see how they can dominate. I do a lot of interviews and I get this kind of, why is Kazakhstan kind of building up its military? Is it looking to challenge Uzbekistan? You're going to go, they really don't have to do too much effort to be the dominant military player in the region. Right now, Kazakhstan actually spends much lower than what would be expected. If we look at the regional share of GDP, just Kazakhstan makes up 57.9% of the GDP, which again makes sense why they would spend the most on the military out of the five. Although what Kazakhstan counts in military spending, it's a bit complicated. We don't have time for that one today. They have a lot of the same rail benefits that, let's say, Uzbekistan has, that it's quite easy to move equipment and materials around the country. And again, it's not surprising that they have, quite a massive amount of military bases stationed right across the country. Most of these, though, right down across the southern area of the country. And again, that's for a whole bunch of reasons we can go into a bit later. Even if, let's say, we look at the regional military spending versus regional GDP, and I think this is one of the really interesting graphs looking at across the five states, is that, let's say if you spend 57% of the region's GDP, well, you'd expect that you'd probably spend 57% of the region's military spending. That would put you at the zero line here. But Kazakhstan always spends way below that. It really doesn't feel that it needs to flex its military muscles as long as it has enough to deter anyone from invading it. Whereas, the Tajiks are usually a little bit below that. They've changed that a little bit, but that's mostly due to the fact that the Russians and Chinese have donated so much to them. And the Turkmens and the Kyrgyz are usually always above that. Not surprising, but the Uzbeks have been way above that for a long time. That's starting to come down. I think one of the biggest stories I'm seeing in the region is this kind of drop down from usually around 4% of GDP under the Karimov era, and now we're starting to get down towards a more kind of normalized 2%. And that's the difference between Uzbekistan, saying I might have to prepare for war against all of my neighbors, to I think cooperation is probably the best way forward. And I think Kazakhstan's pretty much had that decision of, look, a dollar spent on the military is a dollar I don't spend on hospitals. Now, obviously, when people are talking about Kazakhstan, the question always comes up, and I just come back from a bunch of security briefings in the region, and everyone asks me about what the relationship with Russia is like. And, it's very complicated. On one hand, you still look at where most of the military equipment came from, where these vehicles come from, where the majority of kind of the consumables, so just bullets, bandages, boots, that kind of stuff. And again, most of the vehicles they operate are still made in Russia or the Soviet Union. Part of that due to the fact that, Russia just sells these things to Kazakhstan at a big discount. There's pre-existing relationships. Part of it is just that rather than buying a whole new tank and new mechanics and training people, it's kind of easier to just keep upgrading and modernizing old Soviet equipment that they inherited in the 1990s. They are buying lots of different bits and pieces from other states. Some of these are really small. It's like for Japan, it's kind of just Toyota Hiluxes and whatnot. But, it is interesting to see this kind of dichotomy. One, if they've already bought it, like a tank, and they just can slap a modernization kit in, they'll just do that. But when it comes to new materials, so drones in particular, Russia's not really getting as much of a look in. It's okay, if we have to decide between actually spending money and actually spending money, well, then the Kazakhs are really starting to look towards guys like Turkey and the Europeans as well. China's not really a massive player out here, though, interestingly. I guess the other question I always get asked is about a Russian invasion of Kazakhstan's north. And if you look at the deployment maps, I think it is quite interesting that they don't have a huge amount of troops out here. People always wonder what was going on with that. I think it's probably, from what I understand, a combination of most of the Kazakh facilities are just old Soviet ones. Why build a brand new base when you have all these old ones sitting around the country? Part of it is that they don't want to antagonize the Russians, from fear that nationalists might take that the wrong way. And part of it is just that Kazakhstan probably understands that it's much easier to just defend, the core of the country. That even if there was an invasion, they effectively put most of their defenses around the capital and a lot of their really good air defenses. Kazakhstan has made it, it's playing this kind of what I would call the porcupine strategy of, it really can't invade Russia. It can't really project very much, but it's making itself quite formidable as a formidable defense or ability to it can quite formidably defend itself if need be. I don't think that means that the war anytime in the near future. I think Kazakhstan is just sort of making sure it sends the right signals to everyone. But it is a very interesting country to look at. Obviously, we're going to move to Q&A now. I'm going to throw back to Dimitri and Nargis. But yeah, so far it's been, thanks again for having us on. It's been great to talk about some of the most odd and weird militaries I think I've ever studied in the world.
Thank you so much, Michael and Andrew, and apologies for joining late. I was supposed to open this event. Thanks God, Dmitry was here, my co-moderator for this session. I got stuck in Almaty traffic, so it took an hour and a half to get from place. But anyways, without actually, let me give the floor back to Dmitry for your feedback, and then we'll open the floor for the questions. We already started receiving questions. Let me encourage our viewers to put questions in the Q&A section, and those who are watching us on YouTube, you can post it there, and we will try to take as many as we can.
Great, thank you. And hopefully the sound issues have been worked out and you guys can all hear me. So this is great. Like super comprehensive. I had I guess a couple thoughts and a couple of questions, if I may. So first of all, it was interesting to sort of the discussion of the way military forces are organized and in different countries. And I just wanted to highlight that a lot of this, it's worth thinking about how this relates to kind of, right? It's like a lot of this is based on Soviet structures, having a separate border guard that's under whatever the equivalent is in whatever country is. Again, like that's the way Russia does it. That's the way having that separate border guard is very much this kind of post-Soviet legacy kind of um, um, way of organizing things, and maybe that has something to do with lack of trust. Single, have it. You don't want to put all your military eggs in one basket, as it were. If you divide it up among different commands, then you can kind of check, perhaps, if you don't fully trust the military, well, maybe the National Guard or the Interior Ministry or the Border Guard can help, right? So that's, I think, just something to kind of keep in mind as we're thinking about it. Now, a couple of questions that came up as I was listening. I'm curious just to hear a little bit more about how you did this project, right? Like there were a lot of on slides there were a lot of marked. I'm curious, what all those little red marks and yellow marks and so forth. What do they represent? Are those specific kinds of units, and maybe just a little bit more on that, and also just how you got all that data, to the extent you can say, would be really interesting. Um, and then the other kind of set of questions, you kind of hinted at this, but it'd be nice to get a little bit of a summary of what are the militaries, based on what you found, what are the militaries designed to be used for? Just kind of a one-line summary for each country, I think might be helpful for listeners, because we heard, and it's particularly that balance between internal and external. We heard a little bit about Andrew's when he was talking about Turkmenistan, saying okay, well, militaries here in part to defend the capital. Is that also true for the other countries? What's that balance? What are the main goals, and is it uh, and then is there? I guess I imagine there's a difference between the military proper versus other kinds of units, and that may be actually worth mentioning is when you are they just the military proper, or are they all the different kinds of military type units? Like, what do you include in that? So I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll stop there. And I see we have a bunch of questions, so
Yes, I'll try and run through those really quickly. And obviously, we don't get time. I'll try and answer some of the questions in Q&A, and I can, if you email me them as well, I can get to that. Obviously, this is we have a public version of this map you can check out on the Oxford Society's website. But if let's say we go to, let's say go Uzbekistan, and what we do is we have the core units. This would be effectively something within the ground forces. We usually include air defense as well, but at brigade and above. Although what these guys call a brigade might be a little bit below what some people think it is. Then obviously we do bases by size, so that way effectively you can start to see what the larger units are. And on most of these, at least in the private version that we sell for clients, effectively you can have, let's say, a look here, and it will tell you on a full version effectively what the military unit number is here, what their base is, what they do. And you get more details on it. So effectively, if we look here, this is telling us that this base here is, run by the separate rocket artillery brigade, and there's, I won't say which unit it is, but 45113. And then once you get to smaller bases, again, it will effectively just point out more and more facilities. Then the really small ones, these are usually the ones kind of border outposts, forward operating stuff. But we designed it that effectively you can turn on and off what you need to. So air defense stuff, you can see where it's concentrated. Air bases, you can go and check out those individually. Foreign bases, obviously not for Uzbekistan, but where the industry and most the production stuff is. Some of your training grounds, points of administration or interest, and then naval locations and all sorts of interesting stuff. So I'll let people check that out at their own pace because there's a lot to cover on these questions. To go through some of your kind of questions you had, yes, some of these militaries are designed for very different purposes. I think for Kazakhstan, they probably have the closest to what I call like a Western conventional military, and that's mostly to serve as a deterrent, against, let's say, Russia or Uzbekistan or even China having an invasion in. But that's one of the main purposes. Obviously, the National Guard, who is run by the Ministry of Internal Affairs, they're probably a little bit different. They're mostly, effectively looking at, defending or crushing riots or whatever they need to do. And the border services are mostly focused on border issues. So each military is equipped differently, given different rules of engagement, different command structures to kind of better deal with what they have to do. The ground forces, for instance, aren't going to be patrolling along the border, but they're also given artillery and heavy equipment that if they were to go to war, those are who you'd be relying on. Yes, you were talking about the fact having kind of multiple militaries is really important. I think that is part of it is making sure that no one actor can effectively be able to take the government. I think part of this study we've done is looking at effectively wargaming out a few of these scenarios. And one we did is sort of how hard would it be to do a coup in Tajikistan? And if you just have the Russian government, it becomes really difficult. So you need to get effectively the Russians and the 7th Air Assault and a couple of other guys on side to make it work. But you'd need multiple players to jump on, because if there's just one, the others can counter them. And that's how a lot of these militaries have designed their structures, particularly the Tajiks and the Turkmen. Yeah, I'll go to some of these questions because I know we're really low on time. So I guess go to the first one, or Nargis, feel free to jump in.
Let me go kind of group them. And
Yep.
I wanted to start with the kind of regional questions. And there are two questions like focusing on the region at large. In these Central Asian states, is the military apparatus firmly concentrated in the hands of the president, as is often assumed externally, or are there notable patterns of internal competition of fragmented power centers within the armed forces? So how does it look in comparative perspective? And then could you also elaborate on the forms of military cooperation or mutual assistance arrangements that exist among the Central Asian countries? Are there mechanisms designed to address potential threats from Afghanistan or to respond to internal security crises? Who wants to take it?
So a lot of great questions there. Share my map again, just so I can have. Let's go to the Afghanistan question first. Yes, Afghanistan is one of the major issues that these guys have faced, are kind of always concentrated on. Part of that is to do with the fact that so much Soviet infrastructure was built down here. And part of it is just due to the fact that Afghanistan is still a source of instability. If we, let's say, look at Termez, which is on the Afghan Uzbek border, you can see here there's just, in even a city like Termez, there's already just a massive amount of, not only naval bases, but pretty significantly good forces. When we did the wargaming on could ISKP invade Termez, we had to give them so many caveats just to get them across the river. Like the Uzbeks could just deal with it too easily. When it comes to the other one, political, it depends on the service and it depends on the country. Turkmenistan, very political. They won't effectively even let you in kind of near the top ranks of the military unless you're from certain clans, and they really pick and choose. So they want to get military service that way. The very top of militaries, yes, that will very, very much be a political appointment. But when it comes to, let's say, which branch, that'll also be key. Your National Guard, the guys who will probably protect you in a crisis. If something really goes wrong, that's who you want to.
Did we lose Michael?
Make sure are the most politically loyal. When Jabbar is to make sure he kind of secured in so his, let's say more friendly people, and also make sure they got a pay rise. There is political loyalties that come in decision making here. I did see a question come through about the current change in the Tajik defense minister. I think that was interesting, considering the fact that Scherzo has been in.
Michael, can I read the question so that because people.
So I'm just trying to crunch through time. What's going to know?
Yes. Okay. Recently, Ramon has removed the defense minister Sherali Mirzo and replaced him with Emomali Sobirzoda. Many speculate that the reshuffling has been done for the dynastic transition of power. How much control does Rahmon hold over the military, and has the military ever tried to express opposition to the regime? Additionally, how prominent within the upper ranks of the Tajik military? You did it with okay.
To upper ranks, very much so. You wouldn't get to the very top of the Tajik military unless you had some friends, in the palace. But when it comes to, let's say, Rahman really picking and choosing, let's call mid-level officers, he probably doesn't care all that much in the defense area. He would really care for, let's say, the National Guard or the Presidential Guards, because they're the ones that will protect him during a crisis. But like the unit I think he would pay the most attention to are things like the 7th Air Assault guys who are just out here just to the east of Dushanbe, because those guys are effectively have, apart from the Russians, the biggest guns in the capital. So he paid very close attention to that particular unit. The changeover of Scherzo was interesting, considering he's been the defense minister since, I think, 2013, if memory serves. So this is a big change. And I think, if memory serves, Scherzo was from the internal troops before being defense minister. And now they moved back to having kind of more conventional, I think the new guys from the tank or from the ground forces. So that's a little more conventional. I don't read it as, a major shift yet. It might be, but again, it's been massively concentrating power in sort of the border services and the internal troops in recent years rather than the ground forces anyway. As the ground forces, apart from the 7th and a few other select units, really aren't who you would need to make sure the country is secure, particularly in an upcoming period of transition between, Rahman and what would likely be his son. It's very much a political decision, but it's dire for some units. It doesn't matter as much for others. But Scherzo was an interesting one to look at. There's been a few actually changes in senior defense leadership across the region. Yes. We have
I had a question about the Indian base, the Farhor. What's happening there in Tajikistan? Is it still?
Yeah, I saw so many stories pop out about this, and it almost came out of nowhere, considering the Indians. The Indians have been out of Tajikistan effectively for years. What they did what to do is effectively have the base here in Aini, so here, and they also wanted to have a base in Farkhor, which is here. And you can see the Farkhor base was effectively going to be used to ferry out, people and goods in and out. But now you can just kind of fly people into Afghanistan. So it's been pretty desolate and unused for years now. The Indians do have the India-Tajik Friendship Hospital, which sits in Bokhtar, in one of the major military bases up here. That still operates, and Modi visited a few years ago. But Aini, which is the one that everyone was talking about, the Indians effectively started funding it and building it and actually have a facility, I think it's this building here, that they were using. But then the Russians wanted to do as a joint project, and the Indians went, yeah, sure, that's fine. And the Russians said, yeah, I think it should be a joint Tajik-Russian program rather than a Tajik-Indian-Russian program. And effectively the Indians, even back, I think, even though they paid for a lot of the renovations, kicked down to effectively 10 personnel that sat in an office, and then they left, I think it was about 2018 or 2019. It was a long while ago. But now the stories are all coming out that the Indians have finally left. So it's, they still have their position in the Tajik, Indian Tajik Friendship Hospital, but generally, the Indians haven't had a position. And again, it comes down to the obvious question of, if you are India, putting stuff here would maybe be a hedge against Pakistan, but how would you get your air force there? Because you can't overfly China, you can't overfly Pakistan. It would be very difficult for the Indians to operate out of the base anyway. So it's always been kind of a secondary thought.
Yeah, let's take a couple more questions. And I have to say, my internet might disappear again. So if I disappear, then Dmitry, no, it's in your hands. Today is a little bit cursed, but okay, I think we're doing fine. So one question for Andrew: is Turkmenistan's isolationism making its border security harder by limiting economic capacity, regional cooperation? And can I add one more question on Turkmenistan? Where do they train their officers?
All right. Yeah, thank you. So regarding the isolationism, I mean, for the most part, it's the only sort of partnership and connectivity that Turkmenistan has really had when it comes to actual operations on its own soil has been with Russian troops prior to 1999, right? And a lot of that was coming with Russian training, some personnel, but since then, right, they've had relatively little. Its isolationism has, for the most part, kept tensions calm with its neighbors. But its natural gas exports has provided a significant source of wealth. So the matter of providing funding for the military is less of an issue, but it's more of how it chooses to provide that funding. So when it provides certain sectoral funding, it's of its military, I would say it has more to do with how it's choosing to spend its money rather than the actual source of the money itself. But Michael, if you'd like to jump in and add anything on here, I'd really appreciate your thoughts.
Yeah, sort of to look at the, nuts and bolts of it. Turkmenistan don't do a lot of the kind of cross-border training. They do some, they jump in some military exercises, but when they do, it tends to be, the same units that go for training all the time, particularly the 152nd guys or some members of the kind of the really loyal MIA troops. So yeah, they want to kind of keep some of these really loyal, really, cutting edge troops a bit more trained and show them how to do, better fire better and move better. But generally the rest of the military gets kept quite isolated, and that will have effects on what their capacity is going forward. That will probably start to change. I think really interestingly, the 5 defense ministers met for the first time in Samarkand just a few weeks ago. And that kind of was a bit of a red, a big signal to everyone saying, look, hey, look, we're looking to get more regionally invested and work more with everyone, but it's still yet to be seen. It's mostly just been handfuls of special forces and security operators that still mostly work with the Russians.
Thank you. And let me put like the 3 questions into one
Yep.
set of questions, and then we'll wrap up a little bit over time. We had 2 questions on Kazakhstan. One is, what do you think about Kazakhstan's Arlan armored vehicles and the planned production of the Turkish Anka drones in Kazakhstan, and which country has the strongest military production capabilities? And another one, how effective would you say Kazakhstan is in balancing independence from Russia while maintaining deep cooperation? Is the military security relationship mutually beneficial? And one more question on South Korea. South Korea is really taking over Turkey in terms of drones and anti-drone system in Kazakhstan. Would you say that while Russia is busy in Ukraine, South Korea tries to push China out of the market in Kazakhstan? Or why is so sudden turn toward Kazakhstan defense industry?
Yeah, a lot of things to unpack there. So, and great questions, by the way. So the South Koreans are doing some work with the Kazakhs, and they do really good anti-drone systems at the moment. But the technology for South Korea is a little more expensive, and as we've seen in the past, that if it gets to the higher end stuff, the Americans do tend to intervene. There was a point where the Uzbeks were looking to buy a bunch of South Korean jets, and the Americans quashed that pretty quickly. Pushing the Chinese out of the market. The Chinese actually don't do a lot in the Kazakh defense market. It's been really odd. Even one of the new 8-wheel kind of armored vehicle projects they were looking at with the Chinese, they brought the Turkish on as a JV because everyone felt a little bit uncomfortable having the Chinese on that project. When it comes to the defense production, yeah, they do some. It's mostly all kind of Soviet, remnants, but most of it's still fairly minimal and it's small quantities. And again, it comes down to that problem of, let's say if you can make a bullet for 30 cents in Russia, but you can make it in $1 for Kazakhstan, yeah, you could technically go make all the bullets in Kazakhstan, but it'll eat more of your budget. And what will happen is investors get nervous that knowing that, yes, if we put all this money into making all these bullet factories and then the first budget cut comes around for the military, they go, well, why don't we just buy some bullets from Russia and, military's perfectly reasonably fine and we've just saved ourselves a bunch of money. So it does make investors quite nervous on that one. When it comes to the building of the Ankas, this is something that the Uzbeks are looking at as well, and it seems to be going quite successfully. Although, from what I understand, the Kazakhs will build kind of the frame in Kazakhstan, but the brain will still be built back in Turkey. Again, this is a way that Turkey does work with these kind of contracts, and Kazakhstan is also very quick to announce things even before the Turks have actually put pen to paper. So I'd always keep an eye on that little fact as well. But yes, drones are filling that purpose really well to these countries. Some of the new, let's say the Su-30s, they just bought decent jets, but they're very expensive to operate. And if most of what you're doing is just surveilling borders or just quick strikes or fighting against an enemy you don't think is going to have jets anyway, then drones and some of these lighter jets are a really good way to go. Best analogy I can give is it's like buying a Ferrari and then getting annoyed when you take it to the mechanic because you're driving it every day to the shops. You want the kind of car you drive to the shops, that'd be an Anka drone, versus, the Ferrari and the Su-30s you keep at home, for special occasions. And I feel dirty calling an Su-30 a Ferrari because they're not, I don't think they're standard. But anyway, I'm trying to think if I missed any questions. Oh, so they're sort of looking at the Arlam. Yeah, it seems like an okay vehicle, from what I understand. It's that move towards lighter vehicles to respond, because Kazakhstan's probably looking at who it's going to fight, and it's probably not looking at tank battles anytime soon. Obviously Russia is the big question here, and this is obviously, again, while I'm sure the military would love to have every one bullet come not from Russia, just in case, the economists in the room are going to say, look, Russia's just cheaper, it's already built in, we don't need to retrain our mechanics to work on Turkish, caliber missiles, and we don't need to double up our supply lines because we need NATO standard weapons and Russian standard weapons. So there's always going to be that that kind of balance between, if you're too reliant on Russia, it gives Russia too much leverage. But if you also go too many partners in defense contracts, well, then now you're training, 40 different mechanics on 40 different systems with 80 different manuals. And when you need spare parts, you can't take from any of the spare vehicles you have lying around because you only bought one or two of those vehicles from the country. So there's a lot of defense economics here I could probably bore everyone with, but I'll keep it there. Everyone can obviously email me if you have any other questions, and you want to go further into it though.
Thank you so much. Let me go to my co-moderator, Dmitry. Do you want to ask anything or add a comment? No. Oh, we don't hear you. Okay, your sound disappeared. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much, Andrew. You packed so much information into 1 hour. It's years of research. Clearly, that was such a shortcut for us to get a glimpse of the situation on the armed forces in Central Asia. And I will encourage the viewers to check out the data set that you showed us today. Thank you so much, Dmitry, for sharing the burden and for starting this event and helping me with it. And I want to thank the audiences for joining us. This is our last event of this calendar year, but we will resume our events in January. Stay tuned. Please join our mailing list so that you will know what's going on with the program. And last but not least, let me thank Laura Sargent for running this event. Thank you so much, and goodbye.
Thanks so much.